My name is Elena Ward. I'm in my mid-30s, and for most of my adult life, I've been the kind of woman people describe with gentle words, easygoing, supportive, low maintenance. I work in a creative adjacent field. I listen more than I speak, and I've learned how to make myself useful without making myself loud. From the outside, that calm can look like compliance. From the inside, it has always been something else entirely. People tend to underestimate me because I don't rush to correct them. I don't interrupt. I don't perform outrage on cue. In a culture that rewards visibility, I learned early how to survive by being steady instead of spectacular. That steadiness often gets mistaken for softness, and softness for weakness. I've let that misunderstanding sit undisturbed for years. This story isn't about revenge, and it isn't about exposing someone for entertainment. It's about something quieter, and I think more honest. It's about how public images sometimes hide private truths. It's about the slow erosion that happens when small dismissals go unnamed, and the internal shift that occurs when silence stops being an obligation and becomes a choice. My partner posted photos from our vacation, but cropped me out. But what I want to share with you is not the shock of seeing myself erased from a frame. It's the long road that led there, and the even longer one that followed. This is a story about noticing patterns, about watching how people behave when they think you'll never push back, and about what it means to reclaim authorship over your own life without raising your voice. Over the next hour or so, I'll walk you through the emotional terrain of that relationship, who I was to them, how certain roles get quietly assigned, and how easy it is to normalize being minimized. I'll talk about the moment something shifted, not outwardly, not dramatically, but internally. And I'll show you how preparation can look like passivity right up until the moment it isn't. There are no villains twirling mustaches here, no shouting matches, no sudden windfalls or cinematic justice. Just choices, consequences, and the kind of clarity that arrives when you finally stop explaining yourself to people who benefit from not understanding you. I'm sharing this not to ask for sympathy, but to document a process. If you've ever felt invisible in a room full of people who claim to love you, you might recognize some of this. And if you haven't, my hope is that you'll still listen with curiosity rather than judgment. So before we begin, let me ask you something gently and without expectation. Have you ever looked at a perfectly curated image and sensed that something important was missing? To them, I was reliable. That was the word that followed me from room to room, from introduction to introduction. Reliable partner. Reliable plus one. Reliable woman who remembered birthdays, booked flights, smooth conversations, filled silences before they grew awkward. I was the one people nodded at with quiet approval, the one they trusted to handle things without needing credit. In our relationship, I occupied a role so familiar, it was almost invisible. I was the planner, but not the decision maker, the emotional translator, the one who noticed tension before it broke the surface and gently redirected it elsewhere. I remembered preferences, how he took his coffee, which jokes his friends liked, which topics to avoid at dinner. None of this was asked of me explicitly. I stepped into it because it felt natural, and because I was good at it. From the outside, we probably looked balanced. He was charismatic, social, and easy to photograph. I was composed, thoughtful, usually just outside the center of the frame. People would say things like, "You ground him," or "He's lucky to have someone so understanding." They meant it as praise. I received it like a quiet tax. What they didn't say, but what I slowly learned to hear, was that my presence was assumed. My agreement was expected. My flexibility was treated less like a choice and more like a feature of the environment, like good lighting or reliable Wi-Fi. Always there, rarely acknowledged. I don't say this with bitterness. At the time, I didn't experience it as mistreatment. I experienced it as being needed. And for someone who had learned early that usefulness equaled safety, that was enough. When we traveled together, I carried the same role with me. I booked accommodations, checked weather forecasts, and kept track of time zones and reservations. I made sure his work commitments fit neatly around our plans. I took photos of him in front of landmarks, of meals before they were eaten, of moments that would look effortless once posted. I didn't ask to be photographed as often, not because I didn't want to be seen, but because I was used to being the one behind the lens. If someone had asked me then who I was in that relationship, I would have said something kind, supportive, loyal, low drama. I would have said I valued peace over conflict, depth over noise. All of that was true. What I wouldn't have said, what I didn't yet have language for, was how rarely I was centered in my own life. I noticed small things, but I filed them away without inspection. How group conversations drifted past me, how decisions were announced rather than discussed, how my contributions were often summarized by others instead of acknowledged directly. None of it was overt. That's what made it easy to ignore. Invisibility doesn't arrive all at once. It accumulates. It shows up in who gets tagged and who gets thanked, in whose version of events becomes the official one, and how often you're described in terms of what you provide rather than who you are. I was praised for my patience, my adaptability, and my understanding, rarely from my perspective. And still, I stayed quiet. Not because I was afraid, but because I believed that being calm was a virtue. I believed that love was something you proved by accommodating, by smoothing edges, by not making yourself a problem to be solved. I thought maturity meant enduring minor discomforts without complaint. Looking back, I can see how neatly I fit into the role that was available. I was easy to love in a way that required very little adjustment from anyone else. I made things simpler, lighter, more convenient. What I didn't realize yet was that convenience has a cost. At that stage, I didn't feel erased. I felt backgrounded, which seemed acceptable. I told myself that not everything needed to be about me. That visibility was overrated. That confidence didn't require an audience. And maybe all of that could have remained true if the role had stayed balanced, if being reliable hadn't slowly turned into being optional. But at the time, I was still inside the story, not observing it. I was still telling myself that what mattered would eventually be noticed. That presence spoke for itself. I didn't know that silence, left unexamined, teaches people exactly how to treat you. The first time it happened, it was so small I almost missed it. We were already home from the trip when I noticed. A quiet evening, laptops open on opposite ends of the couch, the low hum of normal life resuming. He was scrolling through his phone, half focused, smiling at something I couldn't see. I wasn't paying attention until he said casually, "People really like the vacation photos." I leaned over, more out of habit than curiosity. There it was, a familiar landmark. The cafe we'd stumbled into by accident. The coastal overlook we'd waited nearly an hour to see at sunset. Photo after photo, beautifully framed, carefully edited. And in every single one, I was absent. Not absent in the obvious way. Not cut out crudely or erased with intent. Cropped. Just enough that my shoulder, my reflection, my presence had been trimmed away. The photos told a story where he had traveled alone, unencumbered, self-contained. I felt something tighten, then immediately loosen as I explained it away to myself. Maybe he wanted a clean aesthetic. Maybe it was about symmetry. Maybe I was reading too much into it. I didn't say anything at first. I watched him scroll, watched the comments roll in. Compliments, heart emojis, people asking questions, tagging others, engaging with a version of reality I apparently didn't exist in. When I finally spoke, my voice was light, curious. "Hey, why didn't you post any with me in them?" He didn't look up right away, just shrugged. "Oh, I don't know. These looked better. You know how Instagram is." It wasn't dismissive enough to argue with. It wasn't cruel. It was said with the kind of neutrality that leaves you holding your own reaction, unsure what to do with it. I nodded. I smiled. I told myself it didn't matter. But something had been cut, and I felt it. What stayed with me wasn't the photos themselves. It was how quickly my discomfort had been reframed as overthinking. How efficiently the moment was sealed shut and filed under insignificant. No one else noticed. No one would have questioned it. From the outside, it was just social media, just content. Inside, it landed differently. I started replaying other moments, small enough to be forgettable on their own. times I'd been introduced as the one who helped me with, rather than by name. Times decisions had been made about our plans without my input, then presented as done deals. I hadn't labeled any of it as disrespect before. It felt too mild for that word. This was the first time I felt the disconnect between how present I was in real life and how optional I seemed in the narrative being shared. I didn't confront him, not because I was afraid of the conversation, but because I sensed it wouldn't go anywhere. The explanation had already been given. Any further probing would be framed as insecurity, as sensitivity, as me making something out of nothing. So I did what I'd always done. I noted it. I paid attention to how easily my absence was accepted, how no one asked where I was, how natural it seemed, even to me, to step back and let the image stand on its own. I told myself I was being mature, that I didn't need public validation, and yet a quiet awareness settled in. Not anger, not hurt exactly, more like recognition. This wasn't about a photo, it was about authorship, about who gets to decide which parts of a shared life are worth displaying, and which parts can be trimmed away without consequence. I didn't change my behavior after that. I didn't demand inclusion. I didn't post anything of my own to counter it. Outwardly, nothing shifted. Inwardly, a small ledger opened. I began to watch more closely, not suspiciously, just attentively. I listened to what was said and what wasn't. I noticed how often my presence was assumed rather than acknowledged, how quickly my contributions faded into the background once their utility was complete. That first small cut didn't bleed, it didn't require immediate care, but it marked something important. The moment I realized that invisibility can be curated, and that being cropped out doesn't always look like being pushed away. Sometimes it looks like it has been edited for convenience. After that, nothing dramatic happened, and that was the problem. Life continued in its familiar rhythm. Workdays blurred into weekends. Plans were made, adjusted, and carried out. If you had asked me then whether anything was wrong, I would have said no without hesitation. There was no single incident I could point to that felt serious enough to justify concern. Just a series of moments, each one small, each one easy to rationalize. That's how normalization works. The cropped photos faded into the background of my mind, not because they stopped mattering, but because I taught myself not to dwell on them. Whenever the thought resurfaced, I smoothed it over with logic. He didn't mean anything by it. Not everything is symbolic. I'm not someone who needs to be constantly seen. I repeated those lines often enough that they started to sound like principles. Meanwhile, the pattern continued. Stories about our experiences were told as his stories. When I went to the coast, on my trip last month, I would be sitting right there, nodding along, filling in details if asked. My presence was implied, never stated. I became a footnote to my own life. Sometimes people would look at me, confused. "Weren't you there too?" they'd ask. And he'd laugh lightly, as if the omission were accidental. "Oh yeah, she was with me." Then the conversation would move on. I noticed how quickly it always moved on. Each time I had a choice. Correct the narrative or let it stand. Each time I chose the latter. Not because I agreed with it, but because interrupting felt heavier than enduring. I told myself I was choosing peace. I hadn't yet seen how often peace was being chosen at my expense. The more it happened, the easier it became to accept. Disrespect, when delivered without malice, is especially easy to excuse. There were no raised voices, no insults, just a gradual repositioning where I was no longer central even in shared experiences. I started editing myself too. I stopped offering opinions unless they were asked for. I deferred more quickly. I framed my needs as suggestions, then as afterthoughts. Not consciously at first. It just felt efficient. Less friction, less explanation. And when I did feel the sting of it, I minimized that too. I told myself I was being dramatic, that there were bigger problems in the world, that love didn't need constant affirmation. What I didn't realize was that I was training everyone around me how to treat me. By absorbing the cuts quietly, I was signaling that they didn't require acknowledgement. By staying calm, I was confirming their insignificance. There's a particular loneliness that comes with being surrounded by people who believe you're fine because you've never shown them otherwise. I carried that loneliness politely. I didn't burden anyone with it. I wore it like a sign of emotional maturity. Looking back, I can see how often I confused self-control with self-erasure. The most subtle part was how I defended him, to myself and to others. If someone hinted that he was inconsiderate, I'd step in immediately. He's just busy. That's not how he means it. I became the interpreter of his intentions, even when the outcome consistently left me diminished. I told myself that relationships require understanding, compromise, grace, all true. But grace, when unreciprocated, slowly becomes permission. I remember one evening in particular. We were at a small gathering, people talking over one another, drinks half finished. Someone asked him about a project he'd been working on, one I had helped shape, refine, and execute. He spoke about it confidently, passionately. He didn't mention me once. I waited, not expectantly, just long enough to see if my name would surface on its own. It didn't. When the conversation shifted, I felt a familiar tightening in my chest. Not anger, disappointment muted by repetition. Later, when we were alone, I considered bringing it up. The words formed, then dissolved. It's not worth it. He didn't do it on purpose. I don't need the credit. That last one became my favorite. I told myself I didn't need credit. I needed a connection. But connection requires recognition, and recognition was becoming optional. By the time I realized how often I was shrinking to fit the space available, the behavior felt normal, expected, even. I had internalized the idea that my presence was flexible, that I could be added or removed without changing the story too much. And because I never made it a problem, it never became one for anyone else. Normalization doesn't announce itself. It settles in quietly. Like furniture, you stop noticing because it's always been there. By the time you recognize how cramped the room has become, you've already adjusted your posture to fit it. At that point in the story, I still believed I was choosing patience. I still believed my silence was generosity. I hadn't yet realized that silence, repeated often enough, becomes a role you're expected to play. Roles don't arrive with contracts. No one sits you down and explains what's expected. They emerge slowly, shaped by repetition, reinforced by comfort. By the time you notice them, they already feel established. Mine was clear even if it was never spoken. I was the stable one, the reasonable one, the woman who didn't make scenes, didn't demand reassurance, didn't need to be centered. I was dependable in a way that made other people's lives easier. My reactions were predictable. My boundaries were flexible. My presence was reassuring precisely because it asked for so little. Once a role like that sets in, people begin to rely on it without realizing they're doing so. They assume you'll understand, that you'll adapt, that you won't take things personally, and because you've always done exactly that, the assumption feels justified. I began to see how often decisions were made with the quiet confidence that I would go along with them. Plans are announced rather than discussed. Schedules adjusted without consultation. Social commitments accepted on my behalf, not out of malice but out of habit. When I did push back, softly, politely, it was met with surprise, not anger, confusion, as if I'd briefly stepped out of character. "You're usually fine with this," he'd say, or "I didn't think you'd mind." And because I didn't want to be the kind of person who minded everything, I often let it go. I didn't want to fracture the image of myself as easy, supportive, and low friction. I had invested in that image. I had benefited from it too, in small ways. It kept the peace. It kept me liking. What I didn't see at first was how the role narrowed my options. Once you're assigned the part of the understanding one, your understanding becomes mandatory. Your discomfort becomes inconvenient. Any deviation from the script feels like a disruption rather than a response. I noticed it most in moments where I hesitated. If I paused before agreeing, the pause itself felt loaded, as if silence from me was unusual, worth scrutinizing. The expectation was compliance, delivered calmly and without delay. I started anticipating those expectations before they were voiced. I preemptively adjusted. I simplified my needs. I told myself I was being considerate, but consideration, when it flows in only one direction, stops being a virtue and starts being a mechanism. There's a particular exhaustion that comes from constantly managing how you're perceived, maintaining the version of yourself that others find easiest to live with. I felt it, but I didn't name it. Naming it would have required admitting that something fundamental was misaligned. Instead, I told myself that relationships naturally involve compromise, that I was simply better at it, that my emotional steadiness was a strength, not a sacrifice. And it was a strength, just not one that was being honored. The role extended beyond the relationship, too. Friends began to see me as the one who would always show up, always help, always listen. I became the safe container for other people's stress, their uncertainty, their unprocessed feelings. I held space expertly. What I rarely held was space for myself. I didn't feel oppressed. I felt useful. And usefulness can be dangerously convincing. It feels like purpose. It feels like belonging. It disguises the absence of reciprocity as maturity. It wasn't until much later that I realized how little room there was for me to change. The role I'd been assigned had no flexibility built into it. It didn't allow for anger or disappointment or visible need. It rewarded calm endurance and punished disruption. And because I had played it so well for so long, everyone assumed it was who I truly was, including me. I still didn't see a breaking point ahead. I wasn't waiting for a confrontation or an exit. I believed things could continue this way indefinitely. I believed that as long as I stayed composed, things would remain stable. What I didn't yet understand was that stability, when built on quiet erasure, is temporary by nature. At some point, something has to shift. The shift didn't happen during an argument. There was no raised voice, no accusation, no moment you could circle on a calendar and say, that's when everything changed. It happened on an ordinary afternoon. I was alone at home, the kind of quiet that settles in when there's nothing urgent demanding your attention. I had just finished a work task and was absent-mindedly organizing files on my laptop. Receipts, itineraries, shared documents from the past few years. Practical things I'd managed without thinking twice about it. As I clicked through folders, I noticed how much of our shared life was archived under my name. Reservations I'd made, emails I'd handled, plans I'd coordinated, evidence of labor that had never been visible because it had always functioned smoothly. It wasn't resentment that surfaced. It was clarity. I realized, suddenly and without drama, that if I disappeared from the narrative, the systems would still show my fingerprints everywhere. The smoothness people attributed to luck or ease was, in fact, maintenance. And maintenance, when unacknowledged, becomes invisible by design. I closed the laptop and sat there for a long time. For the first time, I allowed myself to ask a question I'd avoided. If I stopped compensating, what would actually happen? Not in a threatening way, not as a test, just as an honest inquiry. Up until that moment, my silence had been automatic, a reflex shaped by years of prioritizing harmony. That afternoon, it became conscious. I saw how often I stepped in before anyone had the chance to notice a gap, how quickly I filled spaces that might otherwise have revealed imbalance. I thought about the photos again, about how easy it had been to crop me out visually because I'd already been doing it emotionally. I'd been making myself smaller in ways that made omission feel natural. There was no anger in that realization, just a quiet sadness, followed by something steadier. Resolve. I didn't decide to confront anyone. I didn't rehearse speeches or plan exits. I simply decided to stop editing myself preemptively, to pause where I would normally rush, to observe what happened when I didn't smooth every edge. It felt subtle, almost insignificant, but it was the first real choice I'd made in a long time that centered my own experience rather than managing someone else's. That evening, he came home and talked about his day. I listened, as usual. When he asked my opinion on something, I gave it fully, without softening it to make it easier to accept. He looked surprised, not upset, just unaccustomed. The moment passed, but I noticed it. Over the next few days, I paid attention to my own impulses. The urge to say yes immediately, the instinct to minimize my preferences. Each time it arose, I paused, not to create tension, but to check in with myself. What I found was how rarely I'd been doing that. The shift wasn't about asserting dominance or reclaiming power. It was about reclaiming presence, about allowing myself to exist in the same space I'd been managing for others. I didn't announce this internal change. I didn't need to. The most significant transitions rarely require witnesses. They happen quietly, reshaping the way you move through the world rather than the way the world sees you. Still, there was a difference, subtle but detectable. I was no longer rushing to maintain an equilibrium that excluded me. I was curious instead of compliant, observant instead of accommodating. I began to see how often my silence had been interpreted as agreement, how rarely anyone checked in to confirm. That realization didn't make me angry. It made me attentive, because attention, once sharpened, changes everything. That day marked the end of something I hadn't known I was carrying, the belief that my needs were secondary by default. I didn't replace it with entitlement or resentment. I replaced it with discernment. From that point on, silence was no longer my reflex. It was a decision. And decisions, unlike habits, can be redirected. Once silence became a choice, it changed texture. Before, it had been soft and automatic, like background noise you don't notice until it stops. Now it was deliberate, measured. I wasn't withholding information or playing games. I was simply no longer rushing to fill every gap. And in those gaps, things began to surface. I spoke less, but I listened more carefully. Not in the attentive, accommodating way I'd mastered over the years, but in a detached, analytical one. I paid attention to patterns rather than moments. What happened when I didn't anticipate needs? To see how quickly expectations revealed themselves when they weren't immediately met. What surprised me most was how little anyone noticed at first. From the outside, nothing had changed. I was still calm, still supportive, still present, but I was no longer compensating for the imbalance. I wasn't smoothing over missed acknowledgments or reframing dismissals before they had a chance to land. When I didn't volunteer to organize something, it simply didn't get organized. When I didn't remind, things were forgotten. When I didn't follow up, deadlines slipped. Small disruptions easily explained away as a coincidence, unless you were watching closely. I was. He mistook my quiet for fatigue, for stress. Once he asked if I was okay. I said yes, and I meant it. I was more okay than I'd been in a long time. But it didn't look like what he expected wellness to look like. It wasn't compliant. It wasn't self-erasing. So he stopped asking. There's a particular kind of confidence people develop when they believe you'll always adjust. It's not arrogance. It's reliance. And when that reliance is disrupted, even gently, it creates confusion. I let that confusion exist without resolving it. Not out of spite, but out of respect for reality. I wanted to see what would happen if I stopped curating comfort for everyone else. If I allowed consequences to be visible. I still didn't confront him about the photos, or the stories, or the omissions. I wasn't collecting ammunition. I was collecting information. There's a difference. Information tells you where you stand. Ammunition assumes a battle. I wasn't interested in fighting. I was interested in understanding the structure I was standing in. What I learned was sobering. Without my constant maintenance, the relationship didn't become hostile. It became thin. Conversation skimmed the surface. Emotional labor went unreciprocated. When I didn't carry the weight of connection, it simply wasn't carried. And yet, no one named this a problem. The absence of effort was normalized, just as my presence had been. The system adjusted around the missing support rather than questioning why it was gone. That told me everything. Silence, in this phase, wasn't passive. It was diagnostic. It revealed what was essential and what had been taken for granted. It showed me how much of what I thought was mutual had actually been unilateral. I didn't feel triumphant about this. I felt clear. Clarity doesn't arrive with fireworks. It arrives with stillness, with the ability to see something exactly as it is, without needing to excuse or dramatize it. The more I observed, the more I understood that my invisibility hadn't been accidental. It was the natural result of a dynamic where one person consistently made themselves smaller to keep things running smoothly. And because I was no longer doing that, the dynamic began to wobble. Not enough for anyone else to panic, just enough for me to notice. I began documenting, not in a dramatic way. I kept notes in the same notebook I'd always carried. Dates, decisions, patterns, not for leverage yet, for truth. Memory can be unreliable when you've spent years rationalizing. Writing things down anchored me. It reminded me that what I was noticing was real, that I wasn't imagining the asymmetry, That silence, when chosen consciously, can be a form of self-respect. I didn't know where this was going yet. I wasn't planning an outcome. I was simply refusing to continue playing a role that required my erasure. And in that refusal, quiet as it was, something irreversible had already begun. What they never noticed was how much I was learning, because from the outside, my life looked unchanged. Same routines, same tone of voice, same steady presence. If anything, I appeared easier, less reactive, less demanding, the kind of calm that reassures people that nothing is wrong. But internally, I was paying attention in a way I never had before. When you stop rushing to be understood, you start understanding very clearly. I noticed how information flowed, or didn't, what was shared with me automatically, and what I had to ask for. I noticed how decisions were framed after the fact, as if they were inevitable rather than chosen. I noticed how often my agreement was assumed before it was given. I also noticed how systems functioned without me when I stepped back. Bills went unpaid until the last moment. Travel details were forgotten. Commitments overlapped. Things I had been quietly managing for years surfaced only when they failed. Not catastrophically, just enough to be inconvenient. And every time the same thing happened. Mild frustration followed by adaptation. No one asked why things had changed. They just adjusted their expectations downward. That told me something important. The smoothness I had provided wasn't valued as skill. It was valued as absence of friction. Once the friction returned, it was accepted as normal. I documented everything, not obsessively, methodically. I wrote down dates when responsibilities were dropped into my lap without discussion. At times, my input was solicited only after decisions were made. Moments when I was included in execution, but excluded from recognition. The notebook became a mirror. It reflected patterns I'd once blurred out for the sake of harmony. I also began learning in quieter ways. Reading, researching, understanding how financial and legal structures worked. Not because I was planning to leave, but because I realized how little I actually knew about the frameworks governing my own life. Knowledge felt grounding, empowering in a way that didn't require permission. I reviewed shared accounts, contracts, agreements I'd signed without fully examining them because I trusted the person beside me, not because there were red flags yet, but because I wanted to see clearly. Clarity had become my priority. What struck me was how invisible this process was to everyone else. My withdrawal from emotional labor was noticed only as a mood shift, easily dismissed. My preparation registered as nothing at all. People rarely notice when the person holding everything together starts checking the load-bearing walls. I didn't change my demeanor. I didn't signal dissatisfaction. I was careful not to create a narrative of conflict where none was being acknowledged. I wanted to see what would emerge organically, without pressure. What emerged was indifference. Not cruelty, not hostility, just a quiet lack of curiosity about me, my inner life, my experience, my absence from the frame. The photos still existed. They were still liked, still commented on. New ones appeared occasionally. Same careful cropping, same aesthetic. Each one reinforced the story being told publicly. Independence, freedom, a life unencumbered. And each one confirmed something privately. I was no longer part of the image because I was no longer essential to the identity being presented. That realization didn't hurt the way the first one had. It clarified. I began to see the difference between being loved and being useful, between being chosen and being convenient, between being included and being tolerated. And once you see that difference, you can't unsee it. I started positioning myself, not dramatically, not visibly. I updated my professional materials, strengthened independent connections, reclaimed parts of my schedule that had been quietly absorbed into someone else's needs. I didn't announce these changes. I didn't seek approval. I simply acted in alignment with what I was learning. What they never noticed was how self-contained I was becoming. How much of my emotional stability no longer depended on the relationship functioning smoothly. I was building a life that didn't require constant negotiation to exist. There's a misconception that preparation looks tense, secretive, calculated. In reality, it can look like peace. I was peaceful because I wasn't trying to change anyone anymore. I was no longer invested in being seen by someone who benefited from not seeing me. That shift freed up an enormous amount of energy. Energy I had once spent smoothing, translating, accommodating. Now it went into observing, learning, and quietly strengthening my own foundation. By the time the next discovery came, the one that would make everything undeniable, I was ready to receive it without panic or denial. Because what they never noticed was that the woman they thought was fading into the background was actually coming into focus. The reveal didn't come as a shock. That's what surprised me most. If this had happened months earlier, it might have unraveled me. I would have questioned myself, replayed conversations, searched for explanations that softened the edges. But by the time it surfaced, I was no longer invested in protecting a version of the relationship that depended on my blindness. It came quietly, the way most truths do when you're finally prepared to see them. I was reviewing documents one evening, nothing urgent, just tying loose ends the way I'd learned to do instinctively. Cross-checking dates, verifying details, making sure what existed on paper matched what existed in my head. I wasn't looking for anything specific. That's usually when you find what matters. There was an inconsistency, minor at first glance, a detail that didn't align with the story I'd been told or the assumptions I'd been carrying forward without inspection. I paused, not with alarm, but with curiosity. I followed the thread. What unfolded wasn't dramatic. There was no single damning discovery, just a sequence of confirmations that aligned too neatly to ignore. Patterns in communication, timing that didn't quite add up, decisions framed as logistical that carried emotional weight when viewed together. And most telling of all, how easily I was excluded from the knowledge of it. The realization settled in slowly, like fog lifting rather than lightning striking. This wasn't about betrayal in the cinematic sense. It was about parallel narratives, about how much of his life existed adjacent to mine rather than intertwined with it. I sat with that understanding for a long time, not because I was devastated, but because I wanted to be precise. I wanted to separate what I felt from what I knew. Emotion can distort clarity if you let it rush the process. What I knew was this. The distance I'd been sensing wasn't imagined. It had structure, intent, even if not malicious. There were choices being made that relied on my
Cảm ơn bạn đã lắng nghe câu chuyện vừa rồi. Đừng quên like, share và bấm chuông để không bỏ lỡ câu chuyện mới nhất. Hẹn gặp lại.